Here we go. So this is the Get You Some Productions podcast episode. Shit, I don't even know what episode this is. 93, 94, 95 maybe? They actually say that you don't even have a podcast until you've gotten to your 100th episode.
We're getting
So
close
I'm
now.
sorry to say that you're joining when this podcast is not official.
Okay.
But this is the Get You Some Productions podcast where we discuss everything music related from the first note to the last fan and everything in between. So we discuss, appropriate gig attire. We discuss whether you can curse out your fans. We discuss composition techniques. We discuss improvisation. We discuss microdosing, whatever whatever it takes to get to the end result of a good composition or something. I don't know. So before we go on, if you want to support the show, you have to do the things that everyone asks you to do on every single show, which is like, subscribe, leaving rating and review, all that crap. If you want to support the show monetarily, you can do so by clicking the very first link in the show notes. That is our Reverb affiliation. Reverb is an online marketplace for music gear, and you can go click that link, buy something for yourself, no additional cost to you, and it will support the show. Dan, did I miss anything? I don't think so.
Your name is Keith.
Shit. I missed the basic stuff. So my name is Keith.
And my name is Daniel.
Okay.
I'm John.
All right, John.
That's
Our
John.
special guest. Yes.
Yeah, so our very special guest today is John Esposito, a jazz pianist extraordinaire, who was actually a very important figure in mine and Dan's musical development because we studied with John 25 years ago or so. And he showed us that there was a level above the highest level we had thought possible in terms of musicianship. He showed us that there was a level above that. And I don't want to go, we're going to go into John's whole story and we'll let him talk a lot more, but I can tell you that we did a workshop with John up in the Catskill Mountains, and I had diarrhea before those workshops pretty much every time.
You.
So without further ado, let me pull up my notes. Okay, so John Esposito. So the first thing we always ask everyone to do is tell their superhero origin story. So basically, and so it's actually kind of shameful that, and maybe I don't remember, maybe Dan remembers, but maybe we don't know your entire story in music, and also like where you grew up, because this is a very human thing that we do here, like talking to people.
Yeah.
So, I think people will want to know like who you are. So you can start all the way, you can start from diapers if you really want to, and
Okay.
and if we don't get to something, we'll just do another show.
All right.
So you can be as verbose or not as you want, but just tell
I'll
us
try
your
to be succinct.
don't do that.
All right, I won't be succinct. All right. Well, in that case, I grew up in a family that was musical and artistic, and kind of on both sides. My mother's parents immigrated from Avellino in 1918. They were farmers. My grandfather had survived the trench warfare in Austria. On the Austrian front, they got here in 1918. They had 6 kids. 6 kids all died in 2 weeks from the scarlet fever epidemic in the 20s. They had 6 more kids, gave them the same names as the first 6. Those kids grew up to be go through the Depression, the Second World War. My mother is a visual artist. She graduated Pratt in the early 50s, Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. Her brothers, two of her brothers became graphic artists. My mother started out as a graphic artist. She ended up as a painter. Hudson Valley landscapes were kind of specialty. I was born in Brooklyn. We moved up to Marlboro, New York, which is just north of Newburgh, on the west side of the Hudson, in the mid 1950s, when I was 3 or 4 years old. My mother loved music. When she was her final illness in her mid 80s, I was visiting with her in the hospital for a couple of days, and we were just chatting about life in general, our lives in general, kind of summing up. And there was a silence, and then she said, "Do you ever find that you really like African music and African culture?" And I laughed and said, "Yeah. Why do you ask?" And I was ready for some kind of embarrassing answer. And she said, "Well, because when I was pregnant with you, that's all I was listening to was African music." And I was trying to picture her at 22. She was about 4'11". This little girl in an Italian neighborhood in Brooklyn going to the library and taking out records. Okay. At that time, the only records you can get of African music were Library of Congress, French musicologists, field recordings. When I was in my early teens, I had started listening to a lot of music from all over the world, and there were a number of records, again, Library of Congress, Smithsonian Institute, at the local library, and I went and took them out, and I would listen to them over and over again. There was one in particular which I was obsessed with. It was a particular piece, and it was a village song. It just sounded like a whole village, and it was whistle flutes. It was called Whistle Flute Song, the Yergam tribe, Warat, Nigeria. And there was drumming and singing, and it just made me feel great, that particular piece. And it had a kind of an unusual, the end phrase, thing is in 4, or 2/3, as a lot of West African music is. The end was 556 was the figure, and which was kind of unusual, right? And so years later, I had to write something really quickly. I was doing a record for ESP.
But 556, that's just 4/4, John.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, thank you.
That's what I'm here. I'm just a fact checker.
It's good to have a musicologist on the board here. So anyway, I ended up writing this. I was doing this record for ESP, and we ended up doing a concert at the Knitting Factory in New York. And it was a large group, and it was about eight or nine musicians. And there was a piece I'd written which I called Warat, right? It's from the Warat, Nigeria, Yergam tribe. And I purloined that last phrase, and I developed it into a whole piece. We go in to do the concert, and these two Bard alums come up. She had been a dance student. He was a music student. And I hadn't seen them in a while, and they come up, and they have this guy with them, and they introduce me to the guy, and they say, "Well, he just arrived, and he wants to hear jazz. So we saw you were playing." I said, "Okay, great." So I'm in a hurry. I go up, start the set. I announce the tune, and I basically say, I need to give credit for this piece to the Yergam people in Warat, Nigeria. I have no idea where Warat is, whether it's a small place or a big place, or if it's still there, if the people are still there, but this piece somehow really I always connect with. All right, we play the piece, finish the set, I come off, The guy comes up to me, he's crying. And he says, I thought my friends were playing a joke on me. And I said, what are you talking about? He says, I'm from Barat.
Wow.
And he says, I just got off the plane. This is the first place I came. And
Wait, this was a Bard student?
no, this was a guy from Africa who had just gotten off a plane that my Bard friends introduced me to.
Got it.
Never met him before. And I said, well, is Barat like a city or is it a town? He goes, no, it's a tiny village, right? So it was just this
Wild.
pretty amazing, you know, so I synchronicity, you know, and I just said, well, welcome to America, you know. So all of that, I realized later when I went back to the record and I realized, oh, my mother had taken a library record out and was listening to that for whatever 9 months. I must have heard that piece in utero. And when I went to the library to take music out, which is, you know, it's like early 1960s or mid 1960s, I was hearing the same record. And that was why the connection. What was really interesting was the connection with meeting this person from Barat. I think it was just a confirmation on the importance of music for connecting everybody on the planet, how visceral it is. And this is way before, you know, this is before current, you know, internet, you know, and all of that. So this was in the 90s. So in any case, that's my origin story on that side, the importance of my mother in terms of music. The other side, my father's family immigrated from Naples and Rome. My great-grandfather, who was a sculptor, who I did meet, I do remember, also named John. His son, Salvatore, my grandfather, was a violinist, I thought, classical violinist, and he made violins. So I used to watch him make violins as a little kid. And when I got to be 17, I went to college in Albany. He lived in Catskill. They had moved up from Brooklyn. And so I went to visit, and he said, oh, I hear you're studying music. I said, yeah. He said, so you want to be a musician? I said, yeah. He says, what kind of music are you playing? I said, jazz. And he said, you're not playing that bebop, are you? And so I thought, okay, he's a classical guy. He doesn't know, you know, bebop he doesn't know it's a style. He thinks it's a general term. All right. So years pass, he passes. My father drops off an envelope full of photos. And I've got all these, you know, photos of my grandfather at 18 and, you know, like the old bathing suit at the seashore, the full, you know, bathing suit. He was born like 1900, right? So then I come to this photo and it's on my website and it's a jazz band from 1921. And it's the drummers like, you know, holding the sticks like this with the snare. It's outside and it's at White Lake, New York, where the Woodstock Festival was, right? And it's a resort. They're obviously playing a resort gig. And he's got the snare drum, he's got the sticks up like this. And there's you know, trumpet player and there's a clarinet player. And I look and it's my grandfather playing, I forget what it was, maybe a soprano saxophone or clarinet. And there's some other instruments on the ground. There's a violin, a C melody. And I go, what the hell is this? I turn it over and his name was Salvatore Esposito. Sal and the Gang, 1921, White Lake, New York. So I call my father and he says, I don't know. You know, when you're at the funeral, I'll introduce you to somebody. So we get to the funeral. this guy comes up. He says, my father says, this is so and so. He knew your grandfather since they were little kids. And I said, well, can you explain this photo? He says, oh, your grandfather was a jazz musician. And I said, what? He was, he's a classical musician, violinist. He says, no, he played all kinds of instruments, played lots of instruments. He played all kinds of music. And then I think at that point, either he gave me or I found his resume, which included the Paul Whiteman Orchestra from 1921, right? Which is kind of a seminal big band. I think I asked him about Paul Whiteman, and he says, yeah, he was with Paul Whiteman for a while until he got fired when he told Paul Whiteman that he was a shoemaker, not a musician. So, which was
hilarious.
My grandfather's lack of tact was classic.
I like how he didn't even bother to mention to you any of that in the midst of a conversation.
Yeah, it was, he was somewhat eccentric. But I realized that when Charlie Parker hit, my grandfather was 40. And he was a traditional jazz player, like a Dixieland era player. So it must have been like, Satan had arrived with an alto. And so that's why the comment, you're not playing that bebop, are you? That's what that was. So in any case, yeah, he hung around. I think maybe I got my first record out and he was still alive at the end. But anyway, that's kind of the background on that side. I'm not going to go into my grandmother's mafia connected family and the getting ready and the
it's another show.
The funeral home and the getting rid of bodies for the mob. That's a whole other show.
When you're a jazz musician, you have to diversify sometimes. So disposing of bodies may have been an actual. It's a little bit of a side gig,
Yeah.
After the gig, 3 a.m.
Right. So anyway, that was my family. We moved up from Brooklyn. My father was a policeman at various points. He ended up superintendent of police for Metro North, so he ran Grand Central. He had a private investigation business, and he was also chief of police in the town I grew up in, Marlboro. And my mother taught, privately and substituted in schools, taught painting. And then I had one sister who was also a piano player. She was an administrator for Metro North. She didn't make it through the COVID pandemic. And that's pretty much it. So, I'm in good shape. My new family is my partner, who's also teaches at Bard. She's a photographer, video artist, and our 10-year-old daughter. And still playing music. Have a little record company. We're still putting out records. I'm up to number 23 and 24 will be coming out in the next few months. I just got 3 out this year, which was kind of a reboot after the pandemic. I think I had about 2 years of no work, none for the first year, and probably not more than a dozen gigs for the second year. And I think I had gone from, probably playing 150 gigs a year or something like that. So it was weird to go to nothing,
Yeah, it is definitely weird. You just, it's like you have to sort of when you get back into it, it's kind of probably not for you as much as it is for me, because I was going from no gigs to an occasional gig to no gigs to
Yeah.
now I'm thinking, oh shit, I got to start gigging again.
Yeah.
Tell us about you. So, I really want to hear about all the different bands you were in and a lot of the different projects you were in, like especially like, I don't know, like the real like heavy hitting jazz stuff. Because when I knew you, I don't know if like it was around the time that Eric Person CD came out,
Yeah.
which I was a big fan of. And I don't know all of your stuff, but I was also a big fan of your trio, the reimagined standards one.
Yeah.
But those are relatively recent, in the grand scheme of things, but like, so I don't
Yeah.
really know, I don't think we know much about what you were doing in like the early days of your music career,
Yeah.
up until we met you in the late 90s.
So, I guess my career started as in high school. I had a few years of piano lessons, probably when I was, I don't know, 12, something like that. And I think I got like up to like Michael Aaron, book 2 or book 3. But I was very unsure of myself, shy, very uncomfortable with the teacher. It was an old lady. I think she was probably maybe 45. Uh, and terrified of the performance at the end of the year and all of that. So I felt like music was not for me, but I really loved to listen to music. So I was listening to a lot of 20th century classical music. I really liked, and then I discovered uh, blues, and so I was listening to a lot of Delta blues and Robert Johnson and all of that, Skip James, and then a lot of Chicago blues. And I really got into. I wanted to play, but piano seemed. I didn't see how I would be able to do it. And so I started playing harmonica, and at 16, I ended up being invited to join a blues band with a guitarist named Steve Girassi, who just passed recently. Um, at my age, there's like just passed recently ends almost every story, every sentence. So we doing a lot of memorials. Uh, but we were 16 and had this blues band, which became I think he got married at 17 or 18, and um, we ended up being an everything rock band. So initially, the switch from blues harp to keyboard was because he was interested in this young lady, and then a heroic effort to get into her drawers. She was a classical flute player, and he came to me and said, she's joining the band, and we're not going to be a blues band anymore. We're going to be a jazz band, and you can't have jazz a harmonica. And he didn't know about Chet Steelman, and you can't have blues flute. So we're going to have to be a jazz band, and you're going to have to play piano. So
I
being
think he did you a favor.
so he says, I can get you started. So he's trying to get me to play C major 7 to D minor 7 in time on the piano. And after about 20 minutes of that, he gives up and he's screaming at me that he could teach a chimpanzee uh, to play that more quickly. So I stuck with it. I think, and I had like an organ, and she ended up not joining the band, and he got married, and then we formed a band. Let me see. I guess I went away to college for a year. That was SUNY Albany. Um, I was listening to people. I was learning. I was teaching myself how to play in the basement of the dorm, and I was trying to copy probably Coltrane's Equinox and things like that. I was listening to, this is 1970. I was 17 when I went to college, 70, 71. And I was listening to the current music, which was Bitches Brew and Freddie Hubbard's Straight Life and Red Clay. And I had been listening to a lot of Coltrane. I think maybe a couple years before I had gotten, vinyl was really cheap because the record industry was crashing and burning, the jazz industry. And so I had gotten a Coltrane compilation with Giant Steps and Equinox and Central Park West. And I had gotten Kind of Blue, of course, and a Cecil Taylor record called, which was called Air. It's the World of Cecil Taylor is what it is. And those three records I just listened to intensely, and they got me into, so that kind of range of sort of mainstream late 50s, early 60s music, plus more avant-garde music, plus fusion was typical for people my age, because it was all still happening at once, right? So jazz starts 1920 basically, and some of my first gigs, I ended up playing with people who had played in the 20s and 30s, like people my grandfather's age. So so it was all good. I listened to James P. Johnson and Sidney Bechet and really loved it. But I also love Coltrane's Transition and Sonship and Sun Ra and Cecil Taylor and all of that. So what was available to play in Albany, like that was a stone bebop town and some fusion. So I started that first year, I was just practicing. My sophomore year was interrupted by the Vietnam draft. And so I lived in a dorm suite. There were 6 of us, and this is 1970, right? So you have to remember, America was an apartheid country until maybe mid 60s, late 60s, right? And so I'm in school with sort of the first generation of African Americans who are like getting student loans and basic education opportunity grants and everything like that. So I'm in the integrated dorm, right? Which they said with straight face and not embarrassed in any way, is the integrated dorm. They wanted to see if we would kill each other or not. And so that we got along great. It was like basically me, 3 African Americans, a Puerto Rican, and a French Canadian. And some of us were musicians. I ended up later on living with musicians from that dorm suite. 3 guys got drafted the first year. It was the first year of the cancellation of college deferments. This is maybe 71. But I was 17, so my draft number didn't come up until the spring, and of course it was like a really low number, right? 33. So I go to get, so my idea of like, oh, I'm going to play music and so on, everything is like off the table. I'm planning on going to Vietnam and getting killed. So I do the physical. I try to fail it using various substances, and pretty much destroy my health for the next few years in that month leading up to the physical. I passed the physical because basically if you could crawl in, they were taking anybody at that point. And they said, you're going to be drafted in November. So November rolls around. November 14th, I get a notification that there are negotiations in Paris between Kissinger and Lee Ducteau. Nixon is the president. And I'm on hold. Don't do anything. Your certification is now 1H, 1 holding. we could call you with 2 days notice. So I didn't bother going back to school. And so what would have been my sophomore year, I worked as a private investigator for about 9 months for my father, which was a real nightmare, which I won't go into.
That sounds fascinating, by the way.
It is.
God.
It is, but it's brutal.
Okay.
It's the dark underbelly of American life and law enforcement, and yeah, we can talk about that another time.
Yeah.
I don't want to depress myself. And so at the end of that, after my nervous breakdown, I quit that and I joined a rock band with this guy, Steve Gerasi, again. And it's an everything band because he's now married and he needs to make money. And he tells us all it's going to be the blues band again. And then he snookers us into joining the band. And it's, Rolling Stone medley, Beatles medley, Stevie Wonder medley, Jimi Hendrix, et cetera, et cetera. Brothers Johnson, James Brown. And it's like 150 tunes, right? And exactly what I needed to do because I had to play in time. I didn't know anything. So I had to figure out these very basic tunes, I had to be able to play basic harmonies, and which was a struggle because I wanted to play jazz, right? And I thought, oh, jazz is complicated, right? I'm 18 and I'm playing these gigs, and we're doing sort of regional tours, New England, down to Pennsylvania, all over New York, and platform shoes, shiny satin pants, Star Trek shirt, kind of long hair, beard, and piles of women and drugs. And so that went on for about 9 months. Then I went back to school. And that when I went back as a sophomore, I decided that I really wanted to play music. I had originally gone as a political science major because my parents wanted me to be a lawyer because that was the next step up from being a cop, basically. And so I bullshitted my way into the music program, which was seriously divided ideologically and by inclination between very conservative classical music and electronic music. So this is State University, SUNY Albany. The electronic program is run by a guy named Joel Chataby, who's like serious, committed electronic composer. Like his claim to fame was he had 2 computers with random number generators talking to each other, synthesizing sound, and then he was just agonized over how he could remove himself from the process even more by not having to make the decision to hit the on button. This is like, again, 1970, people, smoke a bone, listen to drones. This was the whole thing. But I did meet like sort of everybody from John Cage on down in terms of the whole electronic music world. And I made some of that music. And this is the era of, a closet with oscillators and 2 tape decks and razor blade and tape. So while I'm doing that, I'm now playing with on-campus band called Skytrain, which is I'm the white guy in the band, and we're playing really the music of that era, like R&B, sort of Les McCann Lovers, some sort of Bitches Brew sounding stuff, Red Clay, Donny Hathaway, Roberta Flack, this kind of R&B. Well, there's a vocalist, there's about 10 people in the band. They all play like really great drummer and bass player, minimal piano player, guitarist who really was figuring out how to play the guitar but made great sounds, some conga players, a saxophone player, and as you can imagine, very 1971, whatever it was, Afro thing. And so that I did that for a couple of years, and I started playing with singers, playing standards. And then kind of established myself on the scene in Albany, and by 76 or 7, I started playing with some of the older generation guys. So those would have been J.R. Montrose, who was in the Mingus Band in the 50s. He's a tenor player on Pithecanthropus erectus, which is the first free music piece recorded. And then he had a band with Kenny Dorham. So I think there's one Blue Note record, and there's some other records from the 50s. He got strung out, moved to Europe, spent most of his career in Europe. He had moved back to Albany, and he had a couple of places that he played steadily. So I worked with him. And then there was this multi-instrumentalist named Nick Brignola, who was basically a baritone player, but he famous as a baritone player. Like he won the Downbeat Critics Award every year for lifetime on baritone, and then as multi-instrumentalist. And very technically incredibly proficient, and that kind of any tune, any key kind of thing, and fast and aggressive and all of that. And I didn't like it, but I felt like all of what I really wanted to play was I hadn't figured out, but I knew I wanted to play music like Coltrane, like Miles, like Herbie Hancock, like Chick Corea, like Keith Jarrett. I have his granddaughter in my class right now. And
Who Keith's?
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And which is funny. So I was doing a lot of copying people at that time, or trying to emulate them. And while I was playing with those people, Nick, every once in a while, JR, I actually ended up in his band and played probably for about a year and a half, a couple nights a week. I had my own little quartet with drummer Jeff Siegel, bassist Otto Gardner, and guitarist named Kevin McNeil, who's in the city still. And I had a gig at a place called the Gemini Jazz Cafe, owned by this couple. He was he had done time for bank robbery, and they financed the whole thing. They were coke dealers. And it was a great club, as most clubs financed by coke are. And so I had a gig there, probably for about a year, like when I was 26, I think, maybe a year and a half, playing 3 or 4 nights a week solo. And then 2 nights on the weekends, I had to put a band together. So that was great because I would just call, friends from Boston or New York City, like a headliner, to come up. And then I would have the local rhythm section. And so I learned a lot doing that. And then at the time I was writing, and I didn't really know standards very well. I was still arriving at, I think I was still learning things sort of like phrase by phrase or chord to chord. I didn't really have an approach. I knew that there was an approach because I would talk to, some of these old piano players that would, just play tune after tune, standards. And I would say, how many tunes do you know? And they go, oh, I don't know, 1,000, 1,500. How can they do that, And I eventually figured out, I think I probably told you this at one point because of torturing you guys with playing tunes through keys. I think I basically gave up trying to sound like Herbie Hancock or whoever. I felt like I could wiggle my fingers fast enough, but I couldn't make it sound like I wanted it to sound, which was close to them, those models of Herbie and McCoy Tyner and from the 60s and all of that. And so I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll learn some. They all play bebop before they got in Miles's band, and before I see these early records, they're all playing bebop. So that's obviously what's missing, and I didn't really understand enough how that worked. So I said, well, so what I'll do is I'm going to learn some bebop tunes. I pick half a dozen, some Charlie Parker tunes, and I didn't read very well. I barely read. So let me learn the heads, and then I'll have some licks that'll make it be authentic. And then I learned the licks, the heads, and I was like, well, I'm going to have to play those licks in other keys. So I started learning the tunes through the keys, which necessitated numbering the chords, which I had been resistant to doing. And all the things that I had resisted doing because they weren't expressive turned out to be the things that made everything a lot easier and allowed me to get to the kind of expression I wanted. So probably did like 3 or 4 tunes, and then I tackled Donna Lee, which was really challenging. And I got Donna Lee, this is like massive headaches, right? I finally get Donna Lee to about the 4th key and lightning bolt. Oh, you could number the chords. It's helpful. Oh, his melodies is based on inversions of the chords, but like his F7, it's like it's F7. It's like it's A, C, E flat, but not just F. It's like G sharp, G natural, G flat, and F. It's all the 9s. It's all in. And what scale has all the none? Oh, so he's clearly thinking of the chord and then using the in-between tones, 9, 11, 13, and he's putting them together any way he wants. So I ended up going back and rethinking tunes and learning to arpeggiate the chords. And of course, I should have paid attention. Nick Brignola, when he had to learn a new tune, I watched him one time, like having to learn a new tune, and he was going through and just like arpeggiating, playing all the 7th chords on the alto, one after the other. And then right after that, he was blowing. And so the basic framework of the tune. So you have to know the basic framework, harmonic framework of the tune, and learning it in keys would probably be smart, because then you might need to play it in another key, and also it's the same progressions show up in a lot of tunes. All right. So anyway, I start that process. I'm playing this gig, 26, I get pneumonia, like really bad, and almost die. And so it takes me the whole year to recover. And I recovered, and I remember thinking as I was lying there, like, if you survive this, you better fucking do what you want to do, because this could be over in a minute. And this is also late 20s. I was starting to lose friends to ODs and suicides. And like kind of in a real noticeable number of people. And so I hit 27. I decided to move to New York. And I got there, and I was kind of staying here and there in Manhattan and Brooklyn, and finally ended up with an apartment on 122nd in Harlem, 122nd in Amsterdam. And got settled, didn't quite know how to get into the jazz scene. I started ran out of money, started doing a part-time office job, like temp job, which gave me a steady paycheck. And I started working with singers, and there were these things called showcases that soap opera actors were doing. which was I randomly had done one with somebody, and then I started getting calls to do it, which is basically you're putting together a show of several, or a set, an hour-long show with a soap opera performer who is doing these showcases for industry people. And so the shit has to be like, you have to know how to do the introduction, a company do the ending, and keep the whole thing in your head, and all that. So I did that. So about 6-7 months in, it would be eight months. It would be July. I get a call from this friend, Steve Gerasi, the same guitar player from high school, who was teaching chimpanzees how to play piano at that point. And he says, I'm doing a record. I want you to be on it. And so, okay. And he's writing the music. So he introduces me to the promoter, a guy named Bruce Calabrese. And Bruce's money, he's a student at SUNY New Paltz, but he's running guns and drugs from Fort Lauderdale to Manhattan, actually New Jersey and New Paltz. He's dead. OD. So Bruce, most of the record, I don't think people understand this. Most of the recording industry was, and I'm sure is, mob connected. And like Hollywood, mobsters like to be surrounded. They like to go out at night, And the jazz scene was very much that way. And most of the major labels had this, and certainly the small ones were connected that way. And so in any case, he has this label called Beat City. And so I start meeting this group of musicians. One of them is Michael Berardi, who I later had a working relationship with, and he's there are maybe 5 records of his on my label. He worked a lot with Rashid Ali, Mario Pavone, people like that. And there were some, Mario Pavone was on that label, Steve Gerasi's on the label. And so we get ready for the record date, and Steve is trying to line up musicians, and it's kind of a power struggle between, the producer and Steve over who's going to play on the record. And I recommend John Stubblefield, who I had met. He had come up to Albany to play, and he had stayed at my apartment for a couple of days. And I think I was rehearsing a tune with somebody, and he heard the tune, and he offered to take me on the road. And I said no, because I wasn't ready. And this was in Albany. I was probably 26 or something like that, or before that, probably 24. And I said, oh, maybe I'll run into you. Someday I'm going to move to New York. Maybe I'll run into you. So we go to do the record date, and it's in the Brill Building, which is like, Tin Pan Alley. It's like where all the songwriters are. And it's Sound Mixers, which is, premier studio in New York and probably most of the country at the time. And David Baker is the engineer, who's like a big deal engineer, did all the Brecker Brothers stuff, and And I walk in, and there's like a pile of Coke on the board that looks like K2, right? And I go in, and I'm trying to figure out, the piano is wrapped in gym mats, right? Strapped. And I'm playing, I can't hear anything, So, and I've never been in a studio before. So the engineer comes out, plugs in the headphones. Oh, you can play with the headphones. And then the drummer, Steve was unhappy with the drummer, who happened to be Rashid Ali from Coltrane's band. And
not good enough.
Not good enough. So he asked me if I could recommend a drummer, which I did, Jeff Siegel. So Jeff Siegel gets a call 10 o'clock at night after the first day of recording, and makes a run, shows up the next day at noon, and we had to do this suite, which actually Jeff was much more appropriate for than Rashid. And but Jeff is in tears because there's David Baker putting duct tape on every resonant surface of the drums, including the cymbals. So everything is just clicking, right? So this is 1980. So engineers could use triggers and just use other people's sound. So he had, he liked so-and-so snare sound, and he liked so-and-so's bass drum sound, so-and-so. So that's what he was going to do. But would have been impossible for Jeff to say. So I go, this is my first production credit. I go talk to the producer and I explain it and everything. And, that gets resolved. And the rest of the band had walked in, and it's John Stubblefield. Total coincidence. You need to stop and let me know when.
No, actually, but is this a jazz date?
Yeah, it's a jazz date.
Yeah, because, okay.
It's on my label, actually. I ended
Okay.
up releasing it 30 years later.
What's the name of the record?
Aliqa song, Aliqae
Okay.
song. I think you can find it on YouTube. Steve Geraci, Geraci. And so John Stubblefield walks in. So, wow, what a coincidence, right? And as I go in the tracking room, there's this skinny kid sitting at the piano, like playing the keys off the piano. I'm just standing there kind of dumbfounded. And I think, well, okay, so they got, they found like a really good piano player, and I just get ready to go home, And as I'm leaving, John goes, "Where are you going?" I said, they got a piano player. He goes, No, that's the alto player. So that was Arthur Rames. And so that was my introduction to Arthur Rames, was hearing him play the shit out of the piano and having to follow that, which is what I spent the next 5 years doing, following him playing piano while he played saxophone or guitar. And so he played alto on the session. And it was like a 3 or 4 day session. We hit it off, exchanged numbers. And I was working with a singer from New Orleans in New York City, and a few things up in the Hudson Valley, and another set of clubs following the cocaine trail. And she calls me and she says, "I have this gig in Montreal for 2 weeks at a place called L'air du Temps. Can you do it?" I said, "Yeah." "Can you put a band together?" "Sure." "What do you want?" "Drums, bass, and saxophones." "Okay, do you want like a saxophone player just kind of fill in behind you? You want somebody who can carry a show, or what?" And I asked because she had a repertoire of maybe 15 tunes. And she was a really nice singer, but not very experienced. So I said, "Sure, yeah, I can get, I have a saxophonist in mind." So I call Arthur. He says yes. And so we get to Montreal, and I and the Jeff Siegel and Otto Gardner, who I had played with in Albany, I had called. We're all taking the bus to Montreal, which involves dragging a drum set, acoustic bass, and everything on a trailways, right? And we get there, and there's no Arthur, right? And so we're about to start the gig, and just as I'm about to start, he walks in, breaks down the horn, puts it together, and says, he got stopped at the border. He had to wait. It was this whole nightmare and everything. He's clearly pissed off. He goes, "All right, here we go. Mr. PC, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, right?" And we're off to the races. And I felt like I had been standing too close to the tracks when the caboose came by and grabbed my coat and took me away. When we finished the first tune, as I'm catching my breath, he says, can you play in keys? And I thought, oh, he wants to call a tune in a different key. And I said, sure. He says, impressions, right? So he says, up in fourths, every chorus up a fourth, right, through 12 keys. And, this was like, I was a young player. Impressions, I was still getting lost, like leaving an A off or something. Right. So we get through impressions, and I have a migraine coming on that lasts for 2 weeks. And we finish that tune, and then after that, it's all these other tunes. Do you know Minority? Okay, Minority and minor thirds, Cherokee and whatever it was, minor or major thirds. By the end of it, it was giant steps through keys, and he became the gig was his essentially. She would get up, do her 40 minutes, and then he would do these monumental sets. And I could go into like a whole thing. I think we need to do another.
I think we're going to have to do another one.
Yeah.
Him, yeah. But I can say that was the beginning of my working relationship with him. Lasted pretty much to the end of his life. So he was 21, died I think at 31. AIDS epidemic. And I think I was working with him. He had a band for probably 3 years. We worked together consistently for about 5 years. And then his life kind of fell apart, and I moved on doing my own band, Second Sight, at that point with ultimately with Dave Douglas, Jeff Marks, Jeff Siegel, Alan Murphy, who just passed this year. And so that was about 5 years of that band. During that time, I was working with Carter Jefferson, who connected me with Woody Shaw. This was at the end of Woody's life. He was a mess. But Carter set me up with an audition. He wanted me to be in the band. So he set me up, and I didn't want to be in the band because they were all strung out.
I'm sorry, but you said you played with Woody Shaw?
No, just privately. I did not.
Okay.
So
yeah, we had another guest on the show who's a guitar player who recently made a record, like a tribute to Woody Shaw.
Yeah,
I knew very little about Woody Shaw until we talked to this other gentleman.
Yeah, Woody was actually a big deal in the 70s when disco hit. All the record companies canceled out pretty much everything but disco, right? They were making money hand over fist. You just needed a producer and a singer. That's right. Everything was electronic. And the only working bands, literally, there were two that were on American labels. You have to remember, Blue Note was closing down. ESP was closing down. Atlantic, they were all, the Erdigans were retiring. Everybody was retiring. They were all aging out. They had been in the business since 1940. So by 1970, their early 70s, they're closing. And which is why you could get records for $2 or $3 or $1.50, in bargain bins. They were called cutouts. And this is just before CD technology in 79, 80. And recordings were done in Europe. American bands could only record in Europe, and they were imported, Polygram special imports. I was friends with the guy who did promo for that, John Newcott. And Woody had a band, and Dexter Gordon had a band. He had returned from Europe. Those two were the only bands literally in the United States recording on legitimate labels, unless you were like recording something and making your own little label. That was it. Until Wynton Marsalis and the Young Lions came in, which was a function of CD technology and Sony needing to record something, to have something to put on CDs.
And that was probably, was that the 80s or was that even
That's-
like later than that?
No, it's 1980.
Oh,
1980.
because
I
wasn't
think-
Witten was in with Blakey
Yeah.
originally, right? But
Yeah, he was with Blakey while he was in college, probably 78, 79, something like that, in the
Yeah.
70s.
yeah,
It was in the 70s because he even did a record with Herbie Hancock's group, Ron Carter and Tony Williams in Japan. This is an era when Herbie Hancock with Freddie Hubbard, Tony Williams, and Ron Carter could not get recorded in the US.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable.
So there's a series of VSOP records on Japanese labels
Wow.
because of that. And Wynton is on one of them when he's, and I actually went to hear that band and probably in 78 or 79.
yeah.
So in any case,
Yeah.
that I think we hit so many different things there. I'm not quite sure where we are.
I'll tell you what.
Yeah.
So I'm impressed that we spent like an hour and we got up to like 1980. So we still have like 40 years to go, which is great. I mean, it's like this is what we wanted to do, and I'm so grateful to you to spend the time. So usually, so I do have to wrap up pretty soon. So usually, what we do is we do like the official podcast thing, but it doesn't seem like it's appropriate now because I feel like we sort of have to take a break. We already talked about how we wanted to stop and do a whole Arthur Rames thing, because we really want to like sort of pick up the mantle sort of and maybe become like historians of Arthur Rames a little bit. So if you don't mind, maybe we can do another show where we just pick up and do the rest of your career.
Yeah.
But also, and then maybe even do a third show where we do Arthur Rames. I don't know. I don't know how much. It's like you tell me what you think is appropriate because maybe there's enough for 2 more shows, or maybe there's enough for just one. It sounds like there's probably enough for like 10, but. And actually, I don't want to take advantage of you because I'll do we can make this the John Esposito show for the next like 10 episodes as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I'll tell you what. Why don't we try to conclude me next time?
Yeah.
Fine.
And yeah, I could talk for 10 shows, but I'll save that for my book. And
Great.
Which I always use when I want to make the administrators and the people in the music program at Bard really uncomfortable. I mentioned in passing that I'm doing a memoir, and that really shuts everybody up really quickly.
Yeah.
They're afraid they're going to be included. But Arthur, I'm actually getting ready to do a double album of his music from that era.
Wow.
The beginning stuff that we did. And then I have the second half of my work with him was really electric, was more fusion. And so I have a bunch of recordings of that. But the issues are everything was recorded on cassette back then.
Yeah.
And so I'm dealing with, the technology keeps changing and we're finally getting to the point where maybe a lot of that can be kind of resuscitated. So I'm, in fact, probably doing the first cleanup session on that next week. I have everything. I even have like the liner notes done and the album covers done. But we're cleaning up the recordings.
That's exciting.
That's exciting. And we do like to use the podcast too as opportunity to promote.
Yeah.
All that. So that's going to dovetail nicely. We should definitely do John Esposito Part 2.
Yeah.
And use that opportunity to promote your own work. And
Yeah.
then that will dovetail nicely to Arthur Rames.
Yeah.
So point of focus, but we'll stay focused on you for now. Like that.
All right. That sounds good.
Yeah.
That sounds good.
So here's what we need to do now. We're going to post in the show notes whatever you want us to post, like socials, website, links to streaming, all that junk. So as a follow-up, send me that stuff, because people will know that they'll be able to find, after they watch the show, they'll be able to find it. I also promote pretty actively up until the show release,
Yeah.
whatever stuff you want me to promote.
Okay.
Because I have a decent, Facebook sort of thing going, where there's a lot of people who sort of see my posts on there. So we'll follow up. You'll send me everything. You could send me all the links that you want people to hit, any promotional photos you want people to know about, and then I'll just make a thing. This show, we have one in the can that's going to come out 2 weeks from now approximately, and then this is going to come out a month approximately. And then so if we do another one, maybe we can do it next week at the same time if you have time. Then that one will come out 6 weeks, and then and all along we'll just be promoting all your stuff anyway.
Yeah.
So that'll be our follow-up for this. Yeah, this has been great. I love this. I love just hearing all the stories, because this is like a heyday of, jazz in New York that, people tell the stories, but, it's like, there wasn't a time, who knows if there'll ever be a time like that ever again,
There won't. It's something that I used to work with this trumpet player named Bobby Johnson Jr., whose first gig was Christmas 1929. And he was from Pensacola, Florida. He integrated the big bands. He was the first African American in a lot of the white big bands. And lovely guy. I worked with him probably from the time he was in his mid 60s till he was in his early 80s when he passed. And his music, he had retired to the Catskills, retired. He was still working 7 nights a week, something like that, at the hotels up there. And he would talk about I would ask him a lot of questions, like, because it was like a walking history book. He was the first Black band leader to lead a band downtown at the Savannah Club, Sheridan Square. And was with everybody, with Duke Ellington, with just like every big band you could name. And he used to say, he says, Johnny, he says, that music, he says, that was an incredible time, but it will never, ever happen again. And now that I'm 71, and I'm looking back on, even just the time working with Arthur, which was an incredible scene. Everything that made that music happen, and I think this is true for every generation, everything that is a part of what makes us be who we are changes. And you see it when you teach. I've been at Bard for it'll be almost 25 years. And I've watched it go from, how social media has changed, and use of the internet, all of the implications of that. And, my 10-year-old having all kinds of screens and, and a kind of tech proficiency that people did not have 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. The reality, the paradigm changes with every generation. And in America, that is always extreme. So my great-grandfather, who was born in the probably late 1880s, saw the Wright brothers, the last of the Indian Wars, the Wright brothers, couple of world wars, and the first moon landing.
Wild.
And wait, oh yeah, I was going to say automobiles maybe too, no? Or
Yeah,
maybe
and
that was
automobiles.
earlier.
Yeah, you figure all of the technological changes from say
Yeah.
1890 to 1970. I think he made 88, something like that. So maybe it was a little earlier than 1880s, mid 1880s, and maybe into the early 70s, whatever that period was, what the technological and social changes were within that period, that 100 years, is kind of mind blowing.
100% mind blowing.
Yeah. And we don't think of it so much because we're kind of used to, we're doing something that we would have seen in a Buck Rogers movie, right? Like where they had TV, like movies that were made in the early 19 or mid 1930s, right? Science fiction movies. Who's the other one? Buck Rogers and
Well,
Flash, Flash Gordon.
The Jetsons by itself was like the first to have the video calls, right? Or maybe it wasn't.
No, it was actually in Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers in the 1930s.
Oh, in the 30s.
1930s. Those were serials. Now, TV actually was invented, I think, in the late 20s, but the technology was, but it didn't become anything right until the late 40s. So it took 20 years for it to get in the manufacturing cycle. Things probably moved. That cycle is probably shortened now for a lot of technology. But we're doing something that basically was thought of 100 years ago, and the basic technology was in place 100 years ago. But it's taken until recently when did Zoom become universal? It was like, well, 2021, COVID.
Just a few years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's kind of like how I do a lot of business. Most of my meetings with students are on Zoom because it's just easier than trying to be in the same space at the same time, right? So
Absolutely.
anyway, yeah, it changes. I just curated a jazz festival in the Hudson Jazz Festival. They had headliners. It was 2 weeks ago, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and they wanted some music during the day. They wanted a Bard connection, and I put together a bunch of different groups, or I contacted a bunch of different groups. Kids who living in the Hudson Valley, and then current students, and they all played during the days. So it was like 25 different kids, probably 10 different groups. They were in a couple different parks and a couple different breweries and restaurants, and they all, none of the music was the same. It was great. It was all really good. But as I was listening to it, I was like, oh, this is really cool because it's really different. Had I done this in 1975, the music wouldn't have been most of this music wouldn't have happened, and most of the music, pretty much all the music that the headliners played, I don't know how to put this. It's a different point of view about what making music is from the music that made me want to play. So it was not music that's coming from, kind of the ecstatic music tradition like Coltrane or Cecil Taylor. And it's not coming from the whatever you want to describe Miles Davis's music in the 60s and early 70s. All of the elements that make that music, which the expressiveness, again, there's sort of almost an ecstatic music tradition, informs even that music, and the internationalism of it, and the openness of it, and the complexity of it. That's not really what is going on so much in the jazz mainstream. Is much more kind of reiterating the 1950s or maybe early 60s at best. And that's a function of the musicians are all going to college, right? They're all learning to play in college because you can't really learn on the gig. And the music is much more uniform in certain ways. So those are just generational changes. Some people are not happy with that. I think it's just every generation is different, and now everybody brings who they are, to the table. They do what they can do, and it expresses their reality.
Yeah.
So I don't feel like I'm going to happen again. Where I'm coming.
I don't think so either. Yeah.
John, so we've gone a little bit over, but I'm fine with that.
Okay, thank you.
And I would love to do this if Wednesday I have off from work, so I'm pretty much free on Wednesdays. So we'll text and let's pick up part 2.
Sounds great.
Yeah, dude.
John,
Excellent.
great seeing you again. Thank you so much.
Great seeing you too. All right.
Yeah.
All right.
Take care.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, man.